Hello, dear viewers. Namaskar. Welcome to Moksha Media. By the by, I am Moksha Hiramat. Most of us don't know pre-Kannada literature and its writers and poets. When we begin a talk on Kannada, automatically most of us begin with the poet Pampa, Panna and Ranna. And many of us think that these are the poets, pioneer poets in Kannada literature. But the thing is otherwise. Kannada is a classical language. It has ancestral literature. Folklore gives way to written form of literature. So, the written form of literature in Kannada begins in circa 163 of Common Era. Of course, there are some rock edicts and inscriptions, but they are the part and parcel of the language and literature. But when we try to trace the history of Kannada literature, it carries us to the circa 163 of Common Era. Of course, at that time, Tumbularacharya was a writer. He wrote Chudamani. It is a commentary on religious texts. There are so many writers like this who composed poems and wrote something on the prose and etc. etc. But most of us do not know the names of them and works of them. But when we want to know something about Kannada language and literature, we have to know the pioneers who laid a foundation for the strong base of Kannada language and literature. And Tumbulacharya is one of them. And after that, we have Durvinita. He was a king of Ganga dynasty. Even though he was a ruler, he was interested in art and literature. He himself was a writer. He was well versed in Sanskrit and Kannada. And he wrote Bruhat Kate and Kirutarjaniyatike in Sanskrit, Shabdavatara and Vaddakate in Kannada. Of course, we should not be confused with the title Vaddakate because there is another work with a little bit of different name. But anyhow, some critics opine that another work is based on the work of this Vaddakata. Whatever it may be, let us left it to critics. But one thing is very clear, that Durvinita made rich Kannada language and literature by writing in Kannada. and Sanskrit. He balanced Kannada and Sanskrit because at that time Sanskrit was a scholarly language, and if anyone wanted to prove something his religiosity, then he had to write in Sanskrit. But at the same time, they could not give up their vernacular language because once upon a time that vernacular language was the language of the state. So they maintained the balance between Sanskrit and Kannada language and literature. Of course, then we had Shyamakundacharya, who lived in the circa of 650 Common Era. He wrote Prabhuta. Of course, it is a religious treatise. Thing is, in those days, he wrote it. Then we have Saivata Shivamara, who lived in the circa 800 of Common Era. He wrote Gadastaka. Of course, it is a book on elephants' behavioral trends. It is very astonishing in those days when the writing was not yet developed to that extent. At that time, literature like Saigotamara tried to write something on the animals, especially elephant. It shows to what extent Kannada literature tried their best to give their outlook and ideas regarding different fields which affect the lives of the people and the country. Then we have the famous literature, that is Kaviraja Margakara, who wrote Kaviraja Marga. It is a treatise on poetics. Say, in those days, none of us imagined that anyone could write treatise on poetics. But Kannada literatures did it. So, he wrote that poetics, Kaviraja Marga. Of course, there is a controversy regarding the authorship of Kaviraja Marga. Anyhow, I come to that point when I deal with the work Kaviraja Marga. But here the point is that Kaviraja Margakara lived in 850 and wrote that Kaviraja Marga, that is a royal path for poets. It is a commentary on poetics, semantics and grammar, a rarest of the rare work in any literature, and Kannada literature is proud of that work. Then we have Asaga, who lived in 850 and 877, that is 853. He wrote Karnatakumara Sambhavam Kavya, and in addition to that, he also wrote two works in Sanskrit, that is Vardhamana and Shantinatha Kavya. Of course, on the basis of these Shantinatha Kavya and Vardhamana, Panna wrote that Shantinatha Purana. Anyhow, then we have other poets such as Gunanandi. Gunanandi was a scholar and his disciple was Devendra Saidhantika. This Devendra Saidhantika was the preceptor of the great poet Pampa. Like this, we have the heritage of scholars and preceptors of that period who laid a strong foundation for the literary field of Kannada language and literature. There are so many works, but those works are not found. It is common to all the writers of this pre-old Kannada literature. We have Gunavarma, who lived in the circa 900 of Common Era. He composed Harivansha and Shudraka. It is a Champu Kavya. And after that, we have Shivakotyacharya, who lived in circa 920 of Common Era. Of course, he wrote Vaddaradhane. It is a prose work. Of course, there is again a controversy regarding the authorship of this Vaddaradhane. Some critics opine that it is Brajishnu who wrote that Vaddaradhane. When I deal with the work of Vaddaradhane, I try to say something about that controversy. Of course, that controversy is very common in olden days literature, because most of them were under the pattern of this king or that king. So they have to praise one king or another king, and while praising the king, automatically they have hidden their names, and at that time it is very difficult to come to know the authorship of those writers. So that is why the controversy is there. And in addition to that, we have prose writers. They are Vimalodaya, Nagarjuna, Jayabandhu, ityadi. And we have the poets. They are Sri Vijaya, Kavishwara, Pandita, Chandra, Lokapala, ityadi. See, the common thing of these writers is that their works are mentioned in the later poets of Kannada literature. So, from the later poets, from the later writings of Kannada writers, we come to know such and such writers were there and wrote such and such books. But the unfortunate thing is this, that most of their writings are not found. They are not available. Even today they are not available. We come to know they wrote their works because of the mentioning of them in writings of famous poets like Mallikarjuna and the K.C. Raja, Pampa, Panna, etc., etc. So now we have only two available works. They are Kaviraja Marga and Vaddaradhane. Kaviraja Marga is a commentary on poetics, whereas Vaddaradhane is a collection of stories regarding Jain religion and its munis. So here the point to be considered is that in the 7th, 8th and 9th century, Kannada literatures tried their best to say what they thought in prose. So many literatures, the world famous literatures, begin their prose writings in 17th and 18th century of Common Era. But as far as Kannada literature is concerned, the Kannada literatures tried their best to write in prose already in the 6th, 7th and 9th century, and they have come of maturity at that time. And other languages, other literatures which boast they are international, they don't even know something about that prose writings. So here it shows to what extent Kannada language and literature was rich at that time, and how these pre-old Kannada literatures contributed something to the development of Kannada language and literature. Of course, then the Pampa's era begins. Of course, Pampa is a great poet, no doubt about it. We have his great works, no doubt about it. But before Pampa appeared on the stage, we have these writers, and we should not forget these writers, because these writers and poets laid a strong foundation for the poets and writers like Pampa and others. We talk of something about university wits in the history of English literature. What the university wits did in English literature, these poets and writers such as Tumbularacharya, Shamakundacharya, Durvinita, Saigotta Shivamara, Kaviraja Margakara, Asaga, Gunanandi, Gudavarma the First, Shivakotyacharya or Brajishnu, Vimalodaya, Nagarjuna, Jayabandhu, Sri Vijaya, Kavishwara, Pandita, Chandra, Lokapala, and etc. have done to Kannada language and literature. That is why we have to consider these pre-old literatures as pioneers of Kannada language and literature. Now we can say Kannada is a classical language. We can boast of it. We can write so many things in Kannada language and say it is a literature. But when the environment was not feasible, when the circumstances were not feasible, at that time these writers tried their best and contributed a lot to the development of Kannada language and literature. That is why we have to accept these writers before coming to know something about the other poets and other writers. That doesn't mean we have to neglect the later poets and writers. They have their own state, they have their own position, no doubt about it. But in studying them, we should not forget these brave old Kannada literatures. That is my point. So, when we study these things, automatically the things would have been different. But unfortunately, most of their works are not found except Kaviraja Marga and Vaddaradhane. If the works are found, automatically it gives a different outlook, a new approach to the study of Kannada literature in particular, and southern literature and northern literature in general. Because persons like Durvinita laid a foundation for stories and which lead to Panchatantra Kachagalu later onwards. So now we think that the concept of Panchatantra Kategalu is traveled from north to south. But actually, when we come to know something about Durvinita's works, it is vice versa, that it is traveled from south to north. So, like this, so many things, what we think correct, will be trembled if we study them properly. But the works are not found, and that is the main obstacle in saying it very authoritatively. But of course, these works are mentioned in the famous poets of the later period. That means without those works, they cannot mention it. That is why they wrote such works, and we have those works, but due to so many things, they are not available. And only two available works are there. Of course, they are the basis for the development, for the concept, for the maturity of Kannada language and literature. And now Kannada has come to a stage. To come to this stage, these prevold Kannada literatures contributed a lot. That is what we have to remember forever and ever. Please subscribe. See you in the next episode. Thank you. Namaskar.